Chapter 5 The American Revolution, 1763 to 1783, Part 3 and 4. Part 3 The Coming of Independence. By 1774, British actions had eroded the imperial government's legitimacy among many colonists, and opposition to the Intolerable Acts spread to small towns and rural areas that had yet not participated in the resistance. While colonists, particularly in New England, intimidated, harassed, and sometimes assaulted British officials and colonists who supported the British policies, a September convention of delegates from towns across Massachusetts issued the Suffolk Resolves, urging Americans to refuse to obey the new laws, withhold taxes, and prepare for war. To coordinate resistance to the acts, that month a Continental Congress also met in Philadelphia. Composed of political leaders from all the colonies except Georgia, it included men like John Adams and his more radical cousin, Samuel Adams of Massachusetts, and from Virginia, George Washington and Patrick Henry, the latter of whom famously declared to his fellow Virginians, "Give me liberty or give me death." The Congress adjourned in October of 1774 after it agreed to meet the following May if its demands were not met. It endorsed the Suffolk Resolves and formed the Continental Association to halt virtually all trade with Great Britain and the West Indies. The Congress, through the association, authorized local committees of safety to enforce its policies and act against enemies of liberty who violated the boycott or used it as an opportunity to raise prices. This was the beginning of a process that transferred effective political power from colonial governments, whose authority derived from Great Britain, to extra-legal bodies reflecting the popular will. By early 1775, thousands of men, many of whom were without property and who had never before been part of the political nation, were serving on these committees, which became laboratories for self-government and soon revolution. By 1774 and 1775, the notions of British liberty that had infused British American political culture were being invoked by indignant colonists of all backgrounds, now against Britain itself. As the crisis intensified, more and more Americans based their claims for liberty just not on the historical rights of Englishmen, but upon more abstract language of natural rights and universal freedom. This language included John Locke's idea that natural rights existed prior to the establishment of government, which provided a powerful justification for resistance to imperial British rule. When the Second Continental Congress met in May of 1775, war had already begun between British soldiers and armed Massachusetts citizens. The previous month, British forces marching to Concord to seize arms in that town were met in Lexington by militiamen who tried to resist their advance. In Concord, the British were routed, and after retreating to Boston, scores of militiamen and British troops had been killed or wounded. These skirmishes initiated the American War of Independence and inspired colonists in New England and elsewhere to take up arms. New England militia laid siege to Boston, and, after failed British attempts to break the siege and the arrival of cannon seized from the British by American militia at Fort Ticonderoga, the British abandoned the city. The Second Continental Congress soon authorized the raising of an army, the printing of money to pay for it, and appointed George Washington as its commander. Britain responded by declaring the colonies to be in a state of rebellion and closed all colonial ports and dispatched thousands of troops. Despite the Wars Outbreak, many colonists were reluctant to embrace independence from Great Britain. Many were still proud of British political institutions and culture and the power and glory of the British Empire, and more than a few political leaders worried that rebellion might cause internal social conflict, particularly between elites and the disenfranchised and less wealthy Americans. Leaders in Massachusetts and Virginia, incensed by the Intolerable Acts and confident of their ability to retain authority in those colonies, supported independence, as did many Southern leaders, who guarded their political liberties and were enraged by a British proclamation in Virginia in late 1775 offering freedom to escaped slaves who enlisted in the Royal Army. In New York and Pennsylvania, consensus was more difficult to establish. Opposition to British policies had animated small farmers and urban artisans, whose calls for a greater voice in political life prompted many leaders to hesitate to call for independence. Some in these colonies urged for compromise and predicted that a war would unleash fighting between the colonies. In the beginning of 1776, colonists were strangely both engaged in a war against the British Empire and calling for rights within it. In July 1775, even as Congress organized a continental military, they sent the Olive Branch petition to George III, reaffirming their loyalty to the crown and hoping for a permanent reconciliation. Ironically, not a colonist, but a recent emigrant to Philadelphia from England, Thomas Paine, offered the arguments that catalyzed the final movement towards independence. Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, published in January of 1776, caustically criticized the British Constitution for its principles of hereditary rule and monarchical government, and argued that the residue of tyranny survived in the form of the monarchy and the aristocratic House of Lords. Paine argued that only a democratic system based on frequent elections with a single written constitution could ensure liberty. Most importantly, Paine argued that America's future prospects within the British Empire were limited. Once America was free of the Navigation Acts and trading freely with the world, its prosperity would be assured. Free from Great Britain, the colonies would also not be entangled in its wars with other European powers, against which the American colonists had never had grievances. Paine argued that the colonies' membership in the British Empire was more burdensome than beneficial. Paine ended the pamphlet by assuring his readers that American independence was linked with the freedom of the people everywhere, and argued that the new nation would become a haven for freedom and, I quote, an asylum for mankind. Although most of Paine's ideas were not original, he addressed them to all Americans and made it accessible by expressing them in a clear, direct, and plain language unusual in most political writing at that time. Common Sense quickly became one of the most successful and influential pamphlets in the history of political writing. The intensification of the war, combined with Paine's stirring appeal for independence, sparked more calls for independence in many American communities. On July 2, 1776, Congress formally declared the United States an independent nation, and 2 days later adopted the Declaration of Independence, authored by Thomas Jefferson and revised by the Congress before its approval. Most of the Declaration was a long list of grievances directed at King George III, protesting recent policies that threatened to impose on the colonists absolute tyranny. Although a clause condemning the slave trade and criticizing the king for overturning laws limiting slave importation was eliminated after protests by delegates from Georgia and South Carolina. The impact and legacy of the Declaration was contained in its preamble, written by Jefferson, and stating that all men are created equal, that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson justified independence by arguing that government derives its powers from the consent of the governed, and that when it threatens its subjects' natural rights, the people have the authority to alter or abolish it. The Declaration ultimately asserts the right of revolution. The Declaration of Independence forever altered the meaning of American liberty. It completed the transformation of the object of American independence from the rights of Englishmen to the rights of mankind. Jefferson argued that natural laws, not the British Constitution or the rights of the freeborn Englishman, justified America's separation from Britain, and the Declaration made freedom a universal entitlement for all people, not a privilege to be enjoyed by a corporate body or people of a certain social class. Jefferson drew upon the theories of John Locke, but by substituting the pursuit of happiness for property, in the Lockean triad that opens the Declaration, Jefferson established in America's political culture an open-ended, democratic process in which individuals developed their own potential and sought to realize their own life goals. He made individual self-fulfillment, unimpeded by government, a central element of American freedom, removing tradition as an obstacle to Americans' desire to shape society as they saw fit. The American Revolution created a distinctive definition of national identity resting on freedom. From its beginning, the notion of American exceptionalism, the belief that the U.S. has a special mission to be a refuge from tyranny, a symbol of freedom, and a model for the rest of the world, has been central to our nationality and nationalism. Paine and others believed that the American Revolution was an event of global historical importance, with the power to reshape the world. Without the burden of monarchy, aristocracy, and hereditary privileges of the old world of Europe, America would be a new nation governed by principles of universal freedom. While American colonists were more interested in gaining international recognition and the military aid of other governments than they were in establishing human rights for all people everywhere, the Declaration's words and ideas have been an inspiration to Americans and colonial peoples throughout the world who have sought independence. Flemish rebels, part of today's Belgium and then part of the Austrian Empire, echoed Jefferson's words in declaring their rebellion in 1790, and by 1826, the year that Jefferson died, 20 other declarations of independence had been issued in Europe, the Caribbean, and Spanish America. Revolutionaries in China in 1911 and in Vietnam in 1945 issued declarations influenced by the American predecessor. Although over time the natural rights that Jefferson asserted became less and less part of the declarations he helped inspire, the idea that legitimate political authority rests on the will of the people and that the people have rights has been adopted around the world, inspiring a diverse array of groups including Caribbean slaves, colonial subjects in India, and indigenous peoples of Latin America to fight for their liberties. Part 4. Securing Independence. For Americans, the challenges to obtaining real independence as opposed to declaring it were enormous, and Britain, which saw the colonists as rebellious traitors, was determined to crush them. The new American army faced the greatest military power in the world, with a well-trained, professional, disciplined army that was augmented by hired soldiers from German states like Hesse. The world's most powerful navy and experienced military commanders made up the British Army. The Americans had a local militia and poorly equipped Continental Army, many of whom were undisciplined and no navy to speak of, although it did charter privateers or private ships allowed by the Congress to attack British naval and commercial ships. Yet many Americans had military experience, particularly those who fought in the 7 Years' War or had militia training. Americans were fighting for their own soil for a revolutionary cause that inspired sacrifice and devotion. During the war's 8 years, some 200,000 men served in the Continental Army as volunteers or in the militia, where service was required of every able-bodied man. By the war's end, 1 in 20 of the free white male population in the colonies between the age of 16 to 45 had died, the equivalent of nearly 3 million deaths in today's population. But the hope for independence survived as long as an American army existed. The British learned, despite their power, that the conquest of the 13 colonies was an enormous and expensive endeavor, which might require higher taxes, which Britons in their mother country would resent. The British made a series of mistakes, misjudging the degree of support for independence among Americans and the capacity of America's citizen soldiers. European rivals, particularly France, welcomed British defeat and could equalize the balance of forces in the struggle if they supported America. Although Washington at first would not accept black recruits in the Continental Army, he reversed this policy after a British proclamation offered freedom to Virginia slaves who escaped and served in the British military. Around 5,000 blacks enlisted in the American Army and militia, some of whom were slaves, promised their freedom if they served as substitutes for their master or his son. Blacks fighting under George Washington served in racially integrated units, the last black Americans to do so in regular units until the Korean War. Except for South Carolina and Georgia, the southern colonies also enrolled free blacks and slaves to fight. While these colonies did not explicitly promise the slaves their freedom, many received it individually once the war concluded, at which time Virginia emancipated slaves who had served in the American Army. But many hundreds of blacks, particularly slaves, found freedom and opportunity by enlisting in the British military. Even some of the 17 of George Washington's slaves who fled to the British joined the fight against the American colonists. The sluggish prosecution of the war by British commanders and Washington's determination to avoid direct confrontation in order to buy time to gain international support and to prevent the destruction of the American army made for an inconclusive beginning to the war. Though the British captured New York in 1776 and pushed the Americans back through New Jersey, Washington saved a demoralized and shrinking army in successful surprise attacks in that state at Trenton in December of 1776 and at Princeton in January of 1777. In October 1777, a second British army advancing south from Canada into New York, intended to isolate New England from the rest of the colonies, was surrounded, defeated, and forced to surrender at Saratoga. While the British Army remained quartered in New York, American troops suffered a punishing winter at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, but the victory at Saratoga helped persuade the French in 1778 to recognize the United States and supply it with military assistance. Spain soon joined the war on the American side as well. Though these allies first limited their attacks, the entry of France into the war in particular forced Britain to defend not only America, but much of its global empire, and significantly weakened its capacity to wage war in North America. In 1778, the center of the war moved to the southern colonies, where the British hoped to take advantage of social tensions between frontier farmers and wealthy planters, enlist the many loyalists in the region, and disrupt the economy by encouraging slaves to escape. By 1780, British forces had occupied Savannah, Georgia, and Charleston, South Carolina, and seemed to control much of the South. This year was perhaps the lowest point of the war for the Americans. Congress was basically bankrupt, and the Army, without pay for several months, experienced several mutinies. More and more Loyalists were flocking to British lines along with tens of thousands of slaves. But irregular warfare launched by colonial militia in the South and a brutal civil war in much of North and South Carolina and Georgia between Patriot and Loyalist militias, with both sides committing atrocities and destroying property, did not crush the rebellion in the South. Finally, in 1781, defeats and costly campaigns weakened British forces there commanded by Lord Cornwallis, who moved his army to Yorktown, located on a Virginia peninsula. Washington rushed his forces there, and with French troops laid a siege which, when supported by a French naval blockade, forced Cornwallis to surrender his army there in 1781. Imperial rivalry between Europe's great colonial powers had helped create the American colonies, and it now secured their independence as a new nation. Public support for the war collapsed in Great Britain, where many thought the West Indies were more valuable and merchants hoped to renew trade with America. In 1783, Great Britain recognized America's independence in the Treaty of Paris and ceded the entire area between Canada and Florida east of the Mississippi River. The Americans promised not to persecute Loyalists and to restore them to property seized in the war. But many Loyalists left for Great Britain, Canada, or other parts of the empire. Until independence, the 13 colonies in North America had been only part of Britain's empire in the Western Hemisphere. In Canada and the West Indies, where planters feared slave revolts, colonists refused Americans' appeal to join the war against the mother country. But with the Treaty of Paris, the United States of America became the first independent nation in the hemisphere, reflecting in its boundaries not the unity of a region, but the circumstances of its birth.